A young girl is rushed to the hospital with a mysterious illness that leaves the doctors scrambling for answers. In their urgency to unravel the mystery, they make a desperate plea for the girl's long-lost mother to come forward after years of estrangement. But when her mother does reappear, the horror of the last 24 years of her life would be brought to light, uncovering a harrowing tale that disgusted the world. On April 19, 2008, at 7 a.m., emergency services in Amstetten, Austria, received a distressing call requesting an ambulance for a seriously ill girl. The patient was 19-year-old Josef Fritzl. Upon her arrival at the hospital, doctors struggled to figure out what was wrong with her. They immediately noted several alarming symptoms. Kirsten was unconscious, extremely pale, had lost numerous teeth, and suffered from a severe vitamin D deficiency. Her condition suggested she had never been exposed to sunlight. Little did they know just how correct this statement would be. Josef Fritzl, claiming to be Kirsten's grandfather, arrived at the hospital with a letter from her mother, adding another layer of complexity to the already bizarre situation. The letter read, "Please help her. Kirsten is very scared of strangers. She has never been to a hospital before. I have asked my father to help because he is the only person she knows." This, however, wasn't making any sense. Josef had long maintained that his daughter had run away years ago, leaving him to care for her 4 children. The police decided they needed to find Kirsten's mother. They wanted to question her about the possibility of criminal neglect. Despite exhaustive searches through schools and consultations with social services, Elizabeth had seemingly vanished without a trace over the past 2 decades. What was even more baffling was no one knew or even had heard of Kirsten before. No medical records, no schooling records, and absolutely no proof of existence prior to appearing in the horrendous state. On April 21st, 2 days after her arrival, doctors were no closer to diagnosing Kirsten's condition, prompting them to make a public appeal on television in hopes of persuading Elizabeth to come forward. The police, desperate for answers, went to the Fritzl house to take DNA from the entire family, including the other children who were left behind by Elizabeth. They were hoping to find the father or fathers of the children and to track them down. Everyone complied willingly, except for one person, Josef. He repeatedly claimed he was too busy to provide a DNA sample. On April 26, Josef allowed Elizabeth and 2 more children above the dungeon and into the house. Elizabeth had seen the televised plea, begging with Josef to allow her to assist her daughter, Kirsten. Josef took Elizabeth to the hospital, but the initial doctor wasn't there, so they left. When they returned later that day, the police were waiting to speak with Elizabeth. She was extremely hesitant and did not want to talk at first, fearing the potential consequences. However, at around midnight, with a promise from the police, she would never have to lay eyes on her father again, Elizabeth started talking and revealed an unimaginable truth. Elizabeth disclosed to the police that she had not in fact abandoned her children, nor joined a cult, as Josef claimed. Instead, she had been kidnapped, imprisoned in a dungeon, and subjected to unimaginable abuse. Her father, Josef Fritzl, had had his way with her over 3,000 times during her 24-year captivity. To understand how Elizabeth found herself in such an unimaginable situation, we need to go back to where it all started, the birth of a monster, Josef Fritzl. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935 in Amstetten, Lower Austria, to parents Josef Sr. and Maria Fritzl. Raised as an only child, Fritzl's upbringing was solely managed by his hard-working mother after his father, a severe alcoholic, abandoned the family when he was just 4 years old. Josef never heard from his father again. Any chance for reconciliation disappeared when Josef Sr., who later served as a soldier in the Wehrmacht during World War II, killed in combat in 1944. In 1945, as World War II drew to a close, Josef began attending school. However, he was 2 years older than his classmates because the war had disrupted his life and education. His peers often remarked that Josef seemed to carry an air of superiority, likely due to his age advantage. He was recognized as one of the brighter students in class, but was known as both a loner and a pleasant friend. Interestingly, Josef never invited friends to his home and actively avoided having people visit. Josef frequently spoke of his mother as the best person in the world, even referring to himself as her husband in certain ways. Though he never clarified what he meant, this statement was unsettling to those who heard it. In 1956, Josef, then 21, married 17-year-old Rosemary. The couple had met just a year earlier in a cafe. Within a week of meeting, Rosemary introduced Josef to her family. Her sister recalled that Rosemary was a quiet girl, and Josef was her first boyfriend. Initially, he made a positive impression on the family, but over the years, his demeanor began to change. There was an instance when he commented to both Rosemary and her sister that they should stop eating because he felt they were gaining weight. Following their marriage, Josef and Rosemary moved in with her parents, where her sister also resided. Josef started working at a steel company and often claimed to work late. However, it was later discovered that his supposed overtime was spent riding his bicycle around and peeping into people's windows. In 1957, shortly after their wedding, Josef and Rosemary welcomed their first child. They soon decided to expand their family, eventually having a total of 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters, including Elizabeth, who was born on April 6, 1966. In 1967, Josef was arrested and convicted of SAing a woman at knife point. Although he received an 18-month sentence, he served only 1 year in prison. Upon his release in 1968, Rosemary forgave him and quickly welcomed him back into her life. This conviction was eventually wiped from his record, and by 1977, his criminal history appeared untarnished. Josef faced accusations again when he allegedly attacked another woman as she attempted to enter her home. Fortunately, she managed to fend him off, and he fled, reportedly saying, "One day, I will get you." Despite this threatening encounter, no charges were filed against him. According to Rosemary's sister, Josef treated Rosemary poorly. He dominated the household and expected her to comply with his demands, providing her with little in return. Among his children, Josef showed a particular favoritism towards Elizabeth, which would quickly prove to be a bad thing. The abuse began in 1977, when Elizabeth was just 11 years old, while her father was 42. One day, as she returned home from school, her father told her to go into his bedroom and undress. She followed these instructions out of fear. Her father had been known to beat Elizabeth, and she didn't want to get into trouble. Upon undressing, he told her to lie on the bed. He then kissed her on the lips and touched her inappropriately on her breast. Elizabeth was deadly afraid. He told her she was damaged goods and that no one would want her. Tragically, this was only the start of Elizabeth's ordeal. She would endure ongoing abuse within the confines of her family's home. Just a month after the first incident, the abuse began to get worse. Perhaps with confidence after getting away with it so far, Josef began to touch his daughter inappropriately on the bum and breast while in public. In some instances, even while she hung out with her friends, kissing became a daily occurrence. Elizabeth bravely spoke up to her father, telling him she was uncomfortable. To this, he simply said that if he couldn't have her, then no one could, that he could do whatever he wanted to her. Elizabeth was embarrassed. She stopped inviting friends to her house and quickly became socially isolated. In 1978, during the height of the Cold War, Josef Fritzl began constructing an elaborate underground bunker, cleverly concealed beneath a guest house that he and his family would occasionally rent out to travelers. During this time, the building of such bunkers was commonplace due to widespread fear of war. Utilizing the climate of the time, Josef even secured a grant from the local council to assist in the construction of this hidden project. At 14, Elizabeth, along with her mother and 2 brothers, relocated to a house in Preston, a suburb in northeastern Melbourne. During their month-long stay, Elizabeth experienced a brief respite from her father's abuse, enjoying a period of freedom. Unfortunately, this was cut short when Josef moved to join the family in a flat in Port Melbourne. The abuse resumed immediately, leaving Elizabeth trapped once again. Josef continued inappropriately touching his daughter. and even restricted her from interacting with boys her own age. Desperate to escape, Elizabeth began to run away from home repeatedly. At just 14, she often found temporary refuge in hostels, but there were also nights when the cold, unforgiving streets became her shelter. The fear she must have felt during these times is unimaginable. Eventually, Elizabeth returned home, hoping for change, but the cycle of abuse resumed quickly. Joseph's alcohol abuse had only gotten worse, and things went from bad to worse. On the 28th of September 1980, when Joseph essayed his daughter for the first time, Elizabeth told her father she didn't want to have intercourse with him. But in a drunk slur, he told her, "You will do as I tell you to." Terrified, Elizabeth didn't argue. She didn't want him to hurt her any more than he already was. Over the next 5 months, these incidents occurred frequently, especially when Joseph had been drinking. A few months later, unsure what else to do, Elizabeth ran away again. She had been diagnosed with epilepsy and was on medication. While she was away from home, her mental health began to decline. Elizabeth attempted to OD on her epilepsy medication. Consequently, she was hospitalized for 3 days at Prince Henry Hospital. During her stay, Elizabeth confided in doctors and a social worker about the ongoing abuse she suffered at home, including the essay from her father. The social worker tried to find alternative accommodation for Elizabeth, but unfortunately, none was available, forcing her to return home. Just a week after Elizabeth was discharged from the hospital, Joseph resumed his abusive behavior. He subjected her to daily essaying and emotional manipulation, showing a blatant disregard for his daughter's well-being. Elizabeth lived in a constant state of fear, trapped within the cycle of his relentless abuse. On August 20th, 1984, at just 18 years old, Elizabeth vanished without a trace. Shockingly, her mother Rosemary never looked for her. Joseph fabricated evidence to suggest that Elizabeth had gone at her own will. He presented letters, supposedly written by Elizabeth, claiming she was very happy and wasn't going to come home. In reality, Joseph forced Elizabeth to compose these letters before he traveled to various locations to mail them, ensuring they would be postmarked at different locations. Little did anyone know just how close to home Elizabeth really was. So, where was Elizabeth? One night, Joseph tricked Elizabeth into coming down to the cellar to help him fix the door. He then euthanized her with a chloroform-soaked rag, dragged her underground, and chained her to the wall. Elizabeth would spend the next 4 years alone in the dungeon. Her only visitor was her father, who would come down every few days to have his way with her. He would barely speak to her during these visits. In the beginning, he kept her chained by the wrist, but after a few months, he unchained her, saying that it was getting in his way when he had unconsensual intercourse with her. Above this hidden prison, over 100 tenants would come and go over the next 2 decades, unaware of the nightmare beneath the floorboards. On Elizabeth's 19th birthday, their search for her ceased. After 4 years of being alone, in 1988, at the age of 22, Elizabeth gave birth to her daughter, Kirsten. She faced this difficult and frightening experience entirely alone, with no medical assistance or midwife present. Her only resources were a book about childbirth and a pair of dirty scissors, both provided by her father, who was also the father of her child. Over the years, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children, all fathered by her father. At the time of their eventual release, Kirsten was 19, Stefan 18, Felix 5, and Michael, who tragically passed away 3 days after being born. In contrast, Lisa, 15, Monica, 14, and Alexander, 12, were spared this fate. They were left at the doorstep with notes from Elizabeth stating she couldn't care for them and requesting that Rosemary and Joseph raise them. The reason why Joseph chose to spare these 3 middle children is unknown. Following Michael's death, Joseph burned his body and spread his ashes in the garden. The children raised by Rosemary and Joseph thrived in school and were well known within the community. The couple was perceived as elderly grandparents, selflessly raising their daughter's abandoned children, garnering sympathy and respect. Little did the community know the horrific reality of Josef's actions. The children below were aware of the family above and were even given home videos to watch. However, the children above had no idea about the family below. Despite their circumstances, Elizabeth did the best she could for the children. She constructed lessons and taught them reading, grammar, math, and writing. They were polite and well-educated. Despite Elizabeth and the children being trapped underground, Josef's life continued unaffected. In 1998, he went on a 4-week-long trip to Thailand, where he frequented brothels and massages on the beach. The dungeon was set up well and could sustain the family below in his absence. It had a kitchen, a bathroom, and a laundry room. Over time, Josef became increasingly aware that any potential punishment would only worsen, driving him to maintain his silence at all costs. However, Kirsten's deteriorating health forced his hand. She began experiencing episodes of unconsciousness and seizures. Elizabeth pleaded with Josef to seek medical attention for Kirsten, and once he agreed, the intricate web of lies he had constructed began to unravel rapidly. On April 19th, after Kirsten's emergency room visit and Elizabeth's reappearance and discussion with the police, on April 27th, authorities ventured into the cellar where Elizabeth had been held captive for the past 24 years. Described by police as a labyrinth-like rabbit warren, the cellar was secured by 8 locked doors leading to the living area. Behind the last door, a bookshelf hid a secret passage into the small, windowless dungeon with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, featuring ceilings just 6 feet high. This space offered no access to sunlight or outside air. Upon their release, Elizabeth and her children were admitted to a psychiatric hospital to learn how to adjust to normal life. Stefan, Felix, and Kirsten had never seen daylight until that moment. On March 16, 2009, Josef appeared in court, concealing his face behind a binder. Throughout the trial, he showed little remorse, merely expressing regret for his family, stating, "It can't be undone." Josef faced serious charges, including unconsensual intercourse, incest, false imprisonment, slavery, coercion, deprivation of liberty, and the murder of baby Michael. Shockingly, he justified Elizabeth's imprisonment as an act of a devoted father, claiming he was attempting to shield his wayward daughter from negative influences by locking her away. Elizabeth, now in her 50s, along with her children, have been given new identities. They are reportedly residing in a secure home and neighborhood with 24-hour CCTV coverage. None of them retain the name Fritzl. Josef, on the other hand, was sentenced to life in prison. Within the prison, other inmates refused to associate with him. In March 2016, Josef was assaulted by another inmate, resulting in the loss of several teeth. In 2017, he paid €540 to change his last name to Myrov. He is currently suffering from dementia, and the infamous dungeon has been filled in.